Alright, Thrill Seekers, that was the bass line from the Jackson 5 song I Want You Back, originated by Wilton Felder. What an interesting name that guy had. But the fact that Jermaine Jackson could actually play it on stage is also impressive, even though he didn't come up with it, because that's a hard bass line. Anyway, speaking of things that we don't want back, I have been asked a few times about the idea of warrior monks. So this comes up in the comments now and then. People seem to be interested in this topic, or at least some people. And it got me interested enough to go look it up. And my most trusted source for... What the hell was that? Oh my god, you guys gotta see this. This thing just fell off the roof of the place where I'm doing these videos. Check that out. Like a big plastic pipe. This is a dangerous job. So, as I was saying before we got so interrupted, it's windy out here. So that's why my hair is blowing around, and why everything's blowing off the roof. Anyway, before I got interrupted, let's get back to the topic. Okay, my most trusted source for information on stuff like this lately has been Barbara O'Brien's book, Circle of the Way. This is a really good, concise history of Zen Buddhism. And it kind of... there was another, I think, Dumoulin was the guy's name, a French guy. I think he was French. Maybe he was German. Anyway, some European guy wrote a giant 2-volume history of Zen that used to be my go-to, but that thing was big and unwieldy. Not that it was a bad book, but it was really hard to get through. This one is much more concise, and appreciate Barbara for writing it. So here is what she has to say about Sohei. Sohei are the warrior monks, and it's only a page and a half, or actually just about 1 page long, so I'll just read it to you. The Sohei, monk militias or warrior monks, the word actually translates directly to monk warriors, monk soldiers, were small armies in the service of large, powerful monasteries like Enrakuji. And Enrakuji was a Buddhist monastery in the Tendai sect, so not Zen, but a different sect of Buddhism. There was plenty of precedent going back to at least the Chinese temple of Shaolin for Buddhist monks to fight to defend their temples or country. So that is a reference to the story of how Kung Fu and karate and all these other martial arts were invented by monks who were trying to find ways to defend their temples from people coming up and trying to rob them and attack them and take their stuff, which they didn't have much of, but people were coming and taking it anyhow. But Japan took the concept of fighting monks to another level. Note that the term Sohei wasn't used until the 18th century. Earlier they were called Shuto, members of the congregation, but that's not terribly descriptive, and she's going to tell us why. The original Sohei probably were mercenaries hired to protect temples. Soon enough they began to live as monks when they weren't fighting. They shaved their heads, wore monks' robes, and abided by temple rules and schedules. Historians disagree about whether they received any sort of monastic ordinations. Since their jobs required that they openly and flagrantly violate the Mahayana Brahmajala precepts, the precept against killing and violence and all that stuff, god dang, one suspects they were not asked to take vows or to keep them. More than one historian has described them as nothing but hired thugs. The first Sohei were in the service of Enrakuji, but soon Todaiji, which is a Kegon Buddhist temple, and another temple in Nara, Kofukuji, employed them also. And Kofukuji is of the Hoso sect, which is the Japanese version of Yogacara Buddhism. So again, these are not Zen Buddhists. There was another Tendai temple at the foot of Mount Hei, officially named Onjoji, but more commonly called Midera. Midera also employed Sohei. The two temples of Mount Hei developed a rivalry, and brawls between Sohei escalated into fights to the death and the torching of temple buildings. The fights were nearly always about politics. Unpopular appointments to temple offices were a common point of contention. For example, in 1039, the year 1039, after a long period of truce, an abbot of Midera was reassigned to Enrakuji. A mob of Sohei surrounded the residence of the official who had made the appointment and kicked down his gate. Samurai were summoned to protect him. In the end, the appointment was changed. A prolonged dispute over ordinations torched off a number of raids by Enrakuji Sohei on Midera. At some point, the Midera monks decided they wanted to be ordained in Nara at Todaiji instead of Enrakuji. When they pointed out that Saicho, the founder of Enrakuji, had been ordained in Nara, the enraged Enrakuji Sohei descended on Midera and burned it to the ground. For the record, it was rebuilt. And she also has another little bit about the Sohei on page 223. So this one says, Obu Nobunaga. Some of you may know Obu Nobunaga. I don't know a whole lot about him, but my nephew knows a lot about him because he's really interested in that period of Japanese history. He's basically the worst warlord, murderer, sort of Hitler, Genghis Khan character in Japanese history in 1534 to 1582. A ruthless man who slaughtered anyone in his way, was the first of three warlords who unified Japan. In 1570, warrior monks from Enrakuji and Iko-Iki fighters, we'll not worry about what they are, had joined, because that doesn't have much to do with Buddhism, had joined forces with Nobunaga's enemies, the Asakura clan, at the Battle of Anegawa. Nobunaga was victorious, but he still considered the Buddhist-affiliated fighters a threat to Mount Hei, to be too close to his base for comfort. Thus, the following year, Nobunaga sent 30,000 samurai to destroy everything on Mount Hei. The force circled the base of the mountain and moved up in a coordinated effort, attacking homes and temples, slaughtering monastics and lay people, including children. These are the samurai, not the Sohei. When the samurai reached Enrakuji, its hundreds of buildings were set fire and the monastics were cut down as they ran. And I'm going to skip down a little bit and read you this. Remarkably, especially given the prominence of Rinzai Zen temples were spared Nobunaga's fury. Zen had no armies of warrior monks and did not support the peasant uprisings. That's the Iko-Iki, and that's a whole Japanese history thing that we won't go into. Anyway, further, Japanese temples on the whole were less independent from the government and from the samurai class than those of other Buddhist schools, especially the older sects that had been established in Nara and in the Nara and Heian periods. It's also the case that after the Onin War, the surviving Gozan temples suffered a great loss of patronage and were struggling financially, etc., etc. That's very arcane Japanese history that we won't go into. So the basic deal of the warrior monks is that they weren't really monks. They were hired by certain Buddhist temples to defend the temples, and as you heard, they probably didn't even take the vows of the monks, but they dressed and looked like monks when they weren't fighting people. And the other point, which kind of explains why I don't know a whole lot about them until I looked it up in the book, is that the Zen didn't have much to do with it. Apparently the Zen temples never had warrior monks employed, which is why the only references I'd heard to it before I decided to... this isn't the only place I looked it up. I looked it up in a couple other places, but I decided to use this one for the video. But the reason I probably hadn't heard about it is the only things I can remember is I think maybe Dogen makes a passing reference to it, a critical reference to it not being a good thing to do, although I don't even remember if that's true or not. But the only references I've ever heard in Zen literature to the Sohei were sort of disparaging, like this is not a good practice and we shouldn't do it. So that's why I personally never bothered to study it. The other thing that's kind of interesting to me is something that's alternately disturbs me, and sometimes I think, well, it's a good idea, is that Zen tends to be really practical. So they talk about Barbara O'Brien talks about the fact that the other Buddhist sects were more independent of the government than the Zen sects were. And that seems to be kind of a hallmark of Zen historically, is that it tends to go, okay, what's the most practical thing to do? Oh, the government and their armies are the most powerful people, and they're the ones we should align with to keep ourselves safe rather than starting our own little bands of what they call hired thugs, Sohei, monks. So there's a kind of a tendency in Zen history for Zen temples to kind of cozy up to the government. This happened in China, this happened in Japan, and I get a kind of a sense that it's happening a bit in America too, although maybe I shouldn't go into that too much because that might be a contentious thing. But there does tend to be a tendency to do that, and the unfortunate consequence of this that everybody seems to know about is what happened in World War II. Was some of the Zen temples aligned with the Japanese government, and are in latter day criticized by people for not opposing the Japanese actions in the Pacific War and the World War II. But that's another historical topic that I'd rather not delve too deeply into because it's really sticky and difficult. But again, so that's the deal with the Sohei. A lot of people seem to be asking me, well, how did Buddhists justify doing that because it was such a flagrant violation of the Buddhist precepts? And the answer would appear to be, I think Barbara O'Brien is right here, that they didn't. They didn't justify that. A lot of people, when they hear this, I think in the West, imagine it was something like the Crusades, where the Buddhists were using kind of Buddhist doctrine to try to justify violence and war and etc., etc. I don't know of any instances of that happening. If somebody wants to tell me of some, they can, but there was never anything like the Crusades in Buddhism. There was so I think some people, when they hear about the Sohei, the warrior monks, imagine it was like the Crusades, of people going out and forcing peasants to convert to Buddhism. But that never happened. They were defending the temples, and they weren't using Buddhism as a justification to do this the way Christians and Muslims tended to use their religions as justifications. Like God commands us to do this. There was no sort of idea of Buddha commands us to do this. I get the impression that it was more kind of the opposite. Like Buddha commands us not to do this, but we got to do something because everybody's messing with this. So we got to violate the Buddhist precepts just to manage to keep going. I think that was more the justification. And in modern day sort of egregious things where Buddhists are doing some things in Myanmar that are not good, usually, again, it's not justified as, Buddhist doctrine that we must go do this. It's more like it's a separate thing. So there you go. That's what the deal is with warrior monks. And if you want to support me doing more research about things like this, you can go to the URL that you are seeing on your screen below, which is hardcorezen.info/donate. That is hardcorezen.info/donate. Remember that your donations are my main way of making a living, so I really appreciate your support. But as always, this is offered for free, so you don't gotta pay if you don't want to pay. We will see you next time. Have a good time all the time. Ziggy's inside hiding from the wind, so I'll see if I can get a cameo of him inside hiding from the wind. See you later. Bye. Ziggy does not like wind, so he's hiding in here from the wind where it's not windy. Okay. Have a good nap, Ziggy.